Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Maya Schenwar and Dr. Kim Wilson. Maya Schenwar is director of the Truth Out Center for Grassroots Journalism and board president at Truth Out. She's been a part of many radical books, including as the co-author of Prison by Any Other Name, The Harmful Consequences of Popular Reforms. She's the author of Locked Down, Locked Out, Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do Better. And together with Kim Wilson, she's the co-editor of We Grow the World Together, Parenting Towards Abolition. Dr. Kim Wilson is an artist, educator, writer, and organizer, as well as the co-founder, co-host, and producer of Beyond Prisons, a podcast on incarceration and prison abolition. She holds a PhD in urban affairs and public policy, and her work focuses on examining the interconnected functioning of systems, including poverty, racism, ableism, and heteropatriarchy within a carceral structure. Kim, Maya, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Absolutely. And as I said before we started rolling, this book is like a little glimmer in a world full of triggers. It's We Grow the World Together, Parenting Toward Abolition, which y'all co-edited and was released in 2024. And it's a selection of essays exploring the intersection of caregiving and abolition. And I'd like to start with what I feel is a really important aspect of this project, which is that it treats kids as active participants in these emergent abolitionist futures in a way that, on the one hand, avoids the trope of, oh, kids are the future, and I, as an adult, am just going to sit back and do nothing. And it also avoids the trope of adults being the ones who just hand kids these already finished ideologies and directives. I was wondering if y'all could talk a little bit about that collaborative and multi-generational approach.
Do you want to talk about Maya?
Or
what I'm thinking is your essay.
Yeah, I think that when we first tell people we created this book, this anthology around parenting, a lot of times the first reaction is, oh, it must be a how-to book. Great, I need one of those. And we wanted to ensure that while there are absolutely tools for parenting as an abolitionist, that this was a book that was as much informed by youth and by children as it was informed by adult experience. So we have an essay in the book by EJ, a child with an incarcerated parent who's really speaking to the pain of that experience with having an incarcerated parent, and also their own strategies for resisting it and coping with it and dealing with a thing that they should never have to experience. Other people in the book are writing about how their children are fueling their abolitionist visions, whether because their children are incarcerated or are on the other side of the bars while they're incarcerated. Or in my piece, or in my essay, I was writing about the lessons of hope and possibility and imagination that I draw from my experience of parenting. You know, even as adult abolitionists who talk about imagination all the time, we're also in a world that is constantly trying to squash our imaginations through capitalism, through carceral structures, through all of these things that need us to stop being creative in order to function. And so one of the things that I was thinking about going into this book was, you know, I had a small child who was 3 and 4 throughout the bulk of the creation of this book. And they actually were driving me to think about, okay, what if, you know? And I think that that's one of the most important lessons for me in raising a child, is to listen, to allow ourselves to be sparked by this kind of like uncanny wild force that is happening in young children that gets repressed for a lot of us as we age. And abolition isn't something that can just spring from all our theories. And imagination isn't kind of like this disembodied idea. It's like, okay, what are we thinking about? What are we doing in practice? And I watch my kid like doing that in practice every day. So that's something we talk about throughout the book.
Did you want to add anything, Kim?
Yeah, sorry. I didn't realize I was still muted. Yeah, absolutely. And echoing everything that Maya just said, the only things that I'll add is, going back to the point that you made in your question in terms of, the intergenerational component of the book, but also thinking about, the trope that you said, kids are the future, and it's like this generation or my generation and folks that are older, Gen Xer, and the idea that we have no responsibility, right, to the next generation, to millennials, to Gen Z, and Gen Alpha, and so on and so forth, is really something that I feel the book as a whole and these contributors do counter, right? And we're rooting this idea in terms of what is our responsibility, right? What is our responsibility? But also rooting that in the sense of repair, right? Because we messed up. We did a lot of things wrong. We got some things right, but we did a lot of things wrong. And I feel like the book is an attempt to, think through what accountability looks like in terms of an intergenerational component. And we have, so many essays. I think, as Maya pointed out, that the essay by EJ that starts off the book is one that, a lot of folks tend to sit with, right? They read that, they read, these couple of paragraphs from a 6-year-old, and they're like, my God, right? And it's like, what are we doing, right? What are we doing? We're putting this on children, right? And I like the hope and the injection of imagination that Maya's essay brings into the book and allows us to think more expansively, more broadly, and more about the interdependence that's required in order for us to, not have the kind of, situation that we currently have, as we were joking before we went on air about, unfair questions, like asking people how they're doing in this day and age. And really, really difficult. And if I gave an honest answer, we would be here for 7 hours, right? We would all be unpacking and, and exploring, all of the trauma that we're experiencing. But, to uplift a few of the other essays, I'll start off with mine. The essay that or the interview that I did with my youngest son, Paul, who is currently sentenced to life in prison, and what he's learned from from me as an abolitionist parent. And he says a lot of things there, and he gives me credit for a lot of things, but honestly, I feel like I've learned so much from him throughout this entire process. One, in terms of, what it means, what kind of parent I want to be, because the parent I was when I had him is not the parent that I am today, right? It's just not. And so I'm grateful that he was open and willing to have that conversation. But again, that takes it back to this notion of accountability. Are we willing to listen to our kids? Are we willing to engage in those conversations where, we can hear them say honestly, yeah, this thing really hurt me and you hurt me, right? And that's something that I'm working to heal from. And how do we deal with that rather than shut down? So, I think Heba Goyawed essay on parenthood and genocide is, so resonant for the current moment. And there's so much in that essay that, we can say and discuss. And also thinking and looking at the book Sarah Tyson's essay on interdependent, right? And I feel like that, again, ties back to Heba's essay, ties back to Paul's essay, ties back to Maya's and EJ's essay. So even though it wasn't our intent to have these, contributors be in conversation with one another, we can read the book in such a way where they are in conversation with each other and they can complicate our thinking about all of these issues and what it is that, we owe this generation and how they think about us, right? It's like not just erasing elders or treating, Maya was telling me a few months ago that someone introduced her as an elder. And I'm like, oh my God, if she's an elder, I'm dead. Because I can still, like, what is happening here? The kind of, time warp. But I feel, again, this, it's a collaborative effort between, multi-generations across, different locations, geographic, also, in terms of our thinking and our experiences. And I feel like that is what all of these, essays together and creates this beautifully rich tapestry of, wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really highlights the interconnectedness of just life, like that we don't live single issue lives. We don't live in our silos as much as they try to put us in them. And I really love that aspect of accountability and honesty, because I think it also shows, and the other thing that I appreciate in this book is that it doesn't say like, hey, we're abolitionist parents, so we're like great parents all the time, and we're radical parents all the time, and our kids are the coolest. It's like, no, this is a struggle, and like, let's be real about this. And it's kind of like it felt to me like an offering that you're not just in conversation with each other, but also with the reader. Like the reader is, I felt at least, is asked to participate. Like, how do you feel as a caregiver? Or how did you feel as a child? Also, like, I felt my inner child being like, hey, I've got some things to say, like, which I think also is a part of parenting as well. Like, there's a lot of conversations with your inner child. And another thing that I felt was really important, because I think that there's a lot of conversations about abolition where we talk about the incarcerated, but not talk with them, which always feels a little weird. So I really appreciated that the book included conversations and essays with and by those currently incarcerated. And it does that important job, which you both have touched on, of shining a light on how the prison system creates and fosters generational violence vis-a-vis the violent separation of parents from their children. And as noted in the introduction, about half of the people incarcerated in state prisons have children under the age of 18. I'm going to say that again. About half of the people incarcerated in state prisons have children under the age of 18, which is just staggering. And I was wondering if you could all talk a little bit about this, because I think it's an aspect that not a lot of folks consider when they think of incarceration.
Do you want to go first, Kim?
Sure,
No.
sure. I was
Done for
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so much in what you just said there, and I really appreciate that. What comes through in the book for you as a reader, what came through for you as a reader, is the thing that we say all the time when we're talking about being an abolitionist parent, or parenting from an abolitionist perspective, is that it's not something. Being an abolitionist doesn't mean that you're automatically a good parent, right? Like, let's not conflate the two. And we're working together in community, not just with our children, but with other parents and other kinfolk and, other community members, to really think about and, as you pointed out, to struggle through how we do this thing, because it's hard. This is really difficult. And not to, just be kind of like a downer or a wet blanket, in this moment, but it's to acknowledge the fact that this is a struggle. And it's a struggle that is rooted in the kind of systems that we have put in place that make it purposely difficult for people to parent and to caregive. So I feel that, if the book is talking to you or talking to folks about, where they are, who they want to be as a parent, as a caregiver, whether they're aunties or what have you, whatever your role is in the community and with the people that you feel most accountable to, that it's thinking through these things together, and that the project itself is the thing, right? Like, we're doing this work, we're thinking about this work together, and and to your point, in terms of thinking about that horrible statistic and acknowledging the fact that this is by design, that we have created a system and we have permitted for this system to get to a point where we've normalized the idea of incarcerating, of separating parents from their children, right? And I feel like Dorothy Roberts' essay really addresses this in a very substantive and meaningful way. And for folks that have read Dorothy Roberts' work, on the family policing system, she gets into that in her essay in the book. I feel also that the essay by Ruth Wilson Gilmore in the book is also another example of, how parents have tried to fight back against the, theft of their children, against the forced separation that they experience from their kids. I think about it daily. There's not a moment of the day when I can just kind of, take it all in and, appreciate the beauty and all of that stuff. Yeah, I appreciate the fact that there are flowers and it's spring and it's rain and blah, 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 and all that stuff. And then there's always this kind of, this cloud, this thing that is following you, because it's an awareness that my kid who is incarcerated, who is sitting currently in a cage, does not get to feel that rain on his skin, does not get to smell the flowers, does not get to walk outside, has not seen a bird in months and probably years at this point. That the very little thing, the tiny little things about living, we are robbed from that, right? I was going through some photos recently, and the one thing that really guts me is that, when you have an incarcerated child, you don't have those memories. You don't have those memories. There's not, where's the birthday card that says, oh, I'm sorry, your kid's in prison, right? Where are all of the kind of, the acknowledgments, or the acknowledgments, right? That this is a factor in your life. And as I say in my essay in the book, a little bit later in the book, that you are expected to kill off a part of yourself in order to maintain relationships, including with a lot of people who, feel as though they're, fully justified in their position, that, that's not something that we should talk about. And when we're talking about half of incarcerated people, right, have young children out here who are living either in foster care or with extended families, usually with a sister, an aunt, a grandma, someone, in that capacity. That's a lot of people. And we don't pay attention to those relationships. If anything, we tend to erase them. We tend to overlook them. And, it's like, what are we doing, right? What are we doing? We want a different kind of world. And I feel like so many of the contributors address or get at that kind of, thinking that this system is so harmful. It's so harmful. We live in a country that absolutely hates children, hates women, hates single women with children, right? Demonizes them, right? And does absolutely nothing to help them. So we are offering, as you put it earlier, these are offerings. These are invitations to folks to think about what kind of world we could actually have that is not the current system, which is death-making.
Absolutely. Kim, just every single thing you said was resonating so hard with me. And thank you for sharing it. And I will just add briefly, I mean, I think what we are hoping will come through is that the fight to end incarceration is a reproductive justice issue. And if people care about reproductive justice, they have to care about incarceration, because it is just the brutal reality of ripping apart parents and children, of depriving people of the opportunity to have children in the first place, depriving people often of the choice to have an abortion if they discover they're pregnant inside. It's every single piece of that just taking away those basic facts of both bodily autonomy and human relationship that should be innately things that humans have and can decide for themselves. And I think in the book, I'll just point briefly to two more things. One, Demaria Monday writes in the book about being torn from her 4-month-old child due to criminalization, and then having stretches of years in which she could not see him. And the way in which that punishment was the worst possible torture, you know? And so people so often justify incarceration as like, well, they shouldn't have done the crime or blah, 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 blah. Like this, if anything is violence, this is violence. My own sister, I write briefly in the book, was somebody who gave birth while she was incarcerated. And she discovered she was pregnant when she was arrested. And after that, it was like being pregnant inside is another form of torture, right? And then they wake you up, they induce you at the discretion of the prison. It's not about, oh, I'm going into labor. It's about when is it convenient for the prison for you to give birth. And she gave birth alone, other than a guard who was watching her the whole time, because, of course, this is when you're going to make your prison break, is when you're in labor. And then finally, when she gave birth, she was able to stay with her child. She was shackled immediately after giving birth. She was able to stay with her child for 24 hours. It was hard to hold her baby because she was shackled to the bed. And then she was pulled away in handcuffs and shackles, and my niece was left in the hospital. And eventually we were able to come get her, and she was in my mom's care for a while. And my sister talks about those months as like the way we would think of hell, you know, like just that every single minute of being away from her newborn. And so I think that this visceral image of incarceration, like being a mother who's just given birth and not able to be with her baby for an indeterminate amount of time often, is the image that I think if someone's like, well, why would you be an abolitionist? Like, I think that image, like, take that image. Be like, this is incarceration. Do you think this is a thing that should happen? Do you think that any society should allow this thing to happen? And then we all have to sit with that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think for me, when I was reading that, because I didn't even know, like, I think like 10 or so years ago, I interviewed Mike Africa Jr., and he talked about how he was ripped away from his mother in jail. And I was like, oh, wait, I didn't even realize that was a thing. But of course it is. It was the first time I'd actually thought about it. And so, again, I think that this is something that people like, because it feels so horrifying. You're like, it couldn't possibly. But then again, if you know anything about U.S. history and the present, you'd be like, well, that tracks. But it's like it's so horrific that, and especially as a mother myself, like I legit, it's so awful. I can't even imagine it. And yet you're right. This is what incarceration is. And on the flip side too, if let's say prison were about, which it's not, teaching somebody that they did wrong, like, let's look at how they treat people in prison. Would you ever chain your child up to teach them a lesson? Like, even if you just look at it like what they suggest it is to make people learn their lesson, you can't possibly be suggesting that this is what that's doing. So even just something as simple like that, if you were to take their word for it, which you shouldn't, but like that is just so horrifying. And you touched on something else that you know that like the aspect of caregiving is purposely hidden. And I saw that connection in the book as well, that caregiving, like the realities of prison, is purposely hidden, like the giving birth in prison and being shackled and having your child taken away from you. Caregiving too, it's work that's only valued by the system in sort of a market economy sense. It's made difficult, if not impossible, by the structures of the system, because we hate children and we hate mothers and we hate parents and we hate caregivers. But likewise, life in prison is made to be difficult, if not impossible. Prisoners only valued in terms of their slave labor or private prison contracts. And so in this sense, abolition isn't just about releasing people from cages. It's about releasing us all from the constraints of a system that seeks to destroy care and liberation. And I was wondering if y'all could talk a little bit about the breadth of this concept of abolition, and how it goes beyond just thinking about like closing a prison or getting cops out of certain neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think this is the kernel that this book sprung from. What was it really, this idea that abolition, absolutely, it's about the tearing down, and we never want to minimize that part of it, that we have to dismantle these horrific oppressive institutions, but that simultaneously it's always also about the growing. It's always also about the nurturing and the caring and the building up and the imagining. And we always quote Alexis Pauline Gumbs on this, that this is something, abolition is something generative and germinative and something that grows. And I think that what we hope to do with this book was put out a bunch of different visions for how it grows. And a lot of how it grows is through community building and through care and through love. As Habagoya says in her essay about Palestinian parents living under occupation and genocide, that love fuels resistance, that is not just like, oh, we have love at the same time as all of this, but that is actually a form of resistance. So growing these systems of care, doing this community building in the face of all these structures, including capitalism, as you mentioned, trying to silo and separate us, that these are forms of action. And so that's part of the abolitionist vision that we're trying to nurture. And one thing I love in the anthology is Shira Hassan talks a lot in her interview about building chosen family, building queer chosen family as a practice of abolition, as one of the ways that we put abolition into action, and how we are always doing that in the face of or in resistance to or in sharp contrast with, at the very least, these systems of oppression. But creating those queer chosen family structures, like finding ways of giving each other care that are outside the nuclear family, finding ways of giving each other care that are not about like societal expectations or fitting neatly within the medical industrial complex or fitting neatly within the way that we are supposed to live our lives, capitalism, and make money and all of those things. Finding ways to care for each other that actually like directly resist the prison industrial complex. Like, how do we keep each other out of institutions? How do we resist the ways in which people with various disabilities are oppressed and institutionalized? How do we get each other out of jail? That's also a form of care. How do we obstruct ICE? That's a form of care. So like thinking about all these things that's very, very interconnected and also active. People often think of care as this kind of like passive thing, and that's also a gendered expectation. And so one of the things that the authors in the book contribute is, okay, no, care is active. Care is what keeps the world working. And care is also part of every single organizing movement under the sun, And one last thing I'll point to is in Victoria Law's essay, she writes about how can you support parents and caregivers in the movement. And a lot of it, very, very concrete actions. Keep showing up. Don't just say, oh, if you ever need childcare, like, let me know. Say, I can be available these times, on these days. And she gives us all these very specific tips. And I think that this is something for people to bear in mind as well as we think about abolition as a growing thing, as we think of abolition, like all the possibilities we're building, that they don't always look glamorous. They don't always look shiny. Sometimes they look like building a childcare collective so that people can actually come to your protest, if they have children. And that childcare collective actually might sprout a whole lot of radical ideas and practices itself. Like sometimes the kids in the childcare room come up with better ideas than the people, the adults at the meeting. So, yeah.
I'll just add a couple of things. And again, I mean, I'm sitting here shaking my head yes to everything that Maya was saying, and really appreciate her thoughts on this. But to your point about thinking about abolition beyond cops and cages, basically, and I feel like all of the contributors in one way or another really offer us different expressions of what abolition can look like, right? And give us, a kind of call to action, if you will, right? And how we can think about, abolition really as an embodied practice, not just, a theoretical framework, an ideological framework, right? Which is important, but also how do we carry that with us every day into every space that we're in, into, whether we're catching the bus or going to the office or interacting, at a protest or what have you. What is it that we're doing in those spaces with the people that we're around, right? And I think that that's an important part of it. Something else that came to mind is, Maya was talking, is that, this is a form of racialized and gendered labor, right? And because it's racialized and gendered, it's devalued, dismissed, seen as, not really that important, that this is just a thing that you should want to do, right? I gave a talk a couple of years ago, and I interviewed a bunch of organizers for that talk. And one of the folks that I interviewed, said, who opened up the Google Doc for the meeting, right? And that right there, it's like, who is doing that kind of work? We don't think of that as care work, but that is care work, right? And we don't treat that as important. We treat the work, that, or we value the photo op, right? We value the person who gets to hold the mic. And while that's important, that's only one small part of the entire thing, right? And as long as we continue to, devalue the labor of the folks who are doing this work, it's like we're really not quite getting it, right? So I feel that, something you mentioned earlier, Eleanor, really hit home for me in terms of thinking about, this caregiving reality, not just being hidden, but also being part of, only valued in terms of the market economy sense, right? And when we think about, right now, this particular moment, if we had, for those of us that have been paying attention, that have been part of the prison abolition movement for a long time, we have seen that as, prisons have been the canaries in the coal mine, right? The intensification of suffering that we're currently experiencing, the rise of fascism and all of the different things that we're seeing, all of the, reproductive justice issues and all the rollbacks of, erasure of all of these things, we can look at what has happened in prison. And many people have been okay, absolutely okay, with it happening to certain people. That is part of the problem, right? And we're not having that conversation. We're talking a lot about, oh, well, perhaps what can incarcerated folks teach us? And that's a wonderful conversation to have. But also, what are we getting, right? What are we getting? What are we doing? Are we really grappling with the fact that we normalized a system that has robbed people of their freedom? And the thing that Dorothy Roberts says in her essay about Black mothers have always resisted the destruction of their families by caring for their children, in radical ways, right? She writes about this in her essay. It's something that, for me, it's like, that's a constant battle every single day. And that there are people who think that that's okay, that that is a good use of resources, that that is the thing that we should be doing. I don't ask people the should question, in part because I don't want to hear the crappy ass answers, right? But so to push back on, this idea that this is the choice, right? Or these are the sets of choices that we have landed on. Oh, a world of possibilities of all the things we could have imagined. We have chosen harsh punishment, destruction of families, to put millions, billions of dollars of resources into a system where we have kids who are being born in cages, where we're fine with incarcerating children and sentencing them to life. It's like, that is the thing that we need to start unpacking. That right there, I feel, is part of the broader analysis that this book aims to shed light on, at least for me, in terms of, all of the different perspectives. And it gives us 29 different examples of how we can enact these things in our daily lives without having to go out and start a new nonprofit, without having to, do all of these kind of like really big ideas. Yes, those things are important. No one's saying, no, don't do that. But at the same time, it's like, you can start at home, demystifying the idea that abolition is something that's happening way down in the, in the future in some remote world. Abolition is a thing that is happening right now. And this book teaches us how people have been doing that, not just now, but for decades.
Yeah, thank you for all that. I think that's, there's so many threads to pull on there, but I think, it really speaks to the carceral system also as a lens through which to see our issues, like the how did we get here question. Like, well, the carceral lens can give you a very good idea as to how we got here. And just like, looking at the generation of police from slave patrols, it's like, well, how did we get here? Well, look at the seed that started this poison plant. And I wanted to wrap up here because I think that one of the things that's difficult is, like, I usually say that balance is only something they sell in yoga studios, but like, so finding balance is, like when you're aware of what's going on. And so a lot of what I hear, I have a 3-year-old, and a lot of what I hear is like, well, you got to prepare your kid for the world, because my kid is very sensitive and I want him to be sensitive. He's very gentle. But I keep hearing like, oh, you got to prepare your kid for the world as it is, not as you want it to be, which to me is just like coded speech for like destroy their gentleness, be harsh with them, make them hard and cold, like the capitalist hellscape that they're going to be entering into. And of course, I buck that, but at the same time, there's nuance there, right? We do need to prepare our children for the ills of the world that they will encounter, right? Because you can't just tell them that like the world is as they imagine it, and then they come into the world and they recognize that, oh, that's not correct. So how, like, and I appreciate in the book that there's the acknowledgement again of this struggle, this attempt at balance. We can't totally remove ourselves and live this like, off-grid perfect existence where, we never have to want for a thing and we grow carrots and everyone's happy. But neither are we willing to succumb to the inertia of an empire in decline, of this carceral system. And so as we wrap up here, I'm wondering if y'all could talk a little bit about like, how do you strike this nuance, and how do you feel that this book really addresses that nuance of, no, I refuse to engage with this. I refuse to be okay with like what you were talking about, Kim. And also I need my kid to understand that this is part of the world, unfortunately, right now.
Thanks for that question. And I think that that's a really important one. I feel that, we also need to acknowledge that Black parents in this country have always had to have those conversations with their kids. They've always had to prepare their kids for how to interact and deal with the white world, right? Or the world, right? As it is. 2 essays that come to mind, and I want to read a small piece from Dylan Rodriguez essay on discipline. And he says, and I think this is a really important point and speaks to what you were just talking about. He says, discipline is both a noun and a verb. Radical collective liberation focused work requires an ethic of discipline. It also entails a shared dynamic practice of discipline that is strong, consistent, and transparent, while allowing for grace, fallibility, and failure. The latter is in some ways the hardest part. To discipline whether one another or oneself is not inherently carceral. To the contrary, as some parents and children learn, creating and enforcing boundaries, establishing mutual expectations and responsibilities, and placing limits on certain forms of movement and activity may be crucial to both the preservation of shared life and immediate to long-term survival under conditions of asymmetrical threat and normalized emergency. Right? And he goes on from there. And I feel like that is a really important, idea in practice, right? Because we think of discipline and we're like, oh, it's just, carceral, and it's just associated with harshness, or, a lot of us abolitionists often quote Mariam Kaba, who's quoting someone else, say, hope is a discipline, right? And, I think that there's a world of possibility between those two extremes, right? Between those two pillars. The other essay that I wanted to amplify is the essay towards the end of the book by Pajas and Alejandro Villalpando. And the two of them, write so prolifically and beautifully about what it means to, parent under these harsh conditions, what it means to parent in a world that doesn't allow for folks that have been, forcibly displaced, right, to have that kind of, expansiveness and grace, right? For themselves, for other people. And that parenting under those conditions is really difficult. And for them as parents, a lot of what they're trying to do is create this little microcosm, this little bubble within their home where it's like it contrary to everything that is happening in the outside world, but it's not, it's not an escapist kind of, bubble, right? It's rooted in the reality that, okay, well, how do we fight this? We fight this by building community. We fight this by, going and planting a garden in our neighborhood, right? We fight this in so many different ways by showing up for each other, right? In really tangible and meaningful ways. And in our home, we get to practice the way that we would like to be with each other. I'm also thinking of Jennifer Beach's essay now that I say those words in terms of, what she has to say about, circles, right? Having family circles, and that's the practice of communicating with each other the way that we would like to communicate with people in the rest of the world all of the time, right? And we can do that work in the little spaces that we're in, where we get to show up, and the world can do what it's going to do. We don't always have to, give in to that. We don't have to acquiesce to the status quo. I mean, I feel like that is a really important underpinning thread that runs throughout all of these essays.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about this constantly because we definitely have done a lot of trial and error with how we talk to our kid about scary things. I told them about prison and incarceration maybe a little early, and they were up at night freaking out about it for a month after that. And so it's this real challenge. But I'm really grateful to my partner, Willow, who wrote an essay for the book pretty much about this. And it was grappling with the question of how do you talk to your kid about war and imperialism, but also by extension, prison industrial complex. He says this thing: I can't tell my child that war is not real, but I can tell them that war and imperialism should not be real. I can share my conviction that aggressive state violence is not as natural as the rising and setting of the sun. I can highlight activists who fight against imperial war. They, our child, learned the word protest at the age of 2 from a picture book about Greta Thunberg, given to them by prison abolitionist Miriam Kaba. I can share the work of prison abolitionist writers and organizers, including their other parents. I can tell them that it is possible to break cycles of violence. So that's kind of our guiding principle. We're like, all right, we are going to tell them about the scary things as soon as, we feel like it wouldn't cause them to constantly be up all night in terror. But whenever we talk about prisons or war or policing or genocide, we are also going to talk about the fact that people are resisting, and we're going to do that concretely. We're going to share, the names and the stories and the ongoingness of that resistance, and the fact that people we know are involved, and the ways that maybe they can be involved in all of those things, so that it feels like something empowering, that we can do something right now. And that's been the approach that we've taken, and that I think a lot of the contributors to the book are taking. Certainly not the only one. We certainly don't have it all solved. Sometimes I do worry that our kid is a little too militant about addressing all the problems right now and fighting back against all of these systemic issues to the point that I'm like, wait a second, like we also have to eat breakfast. You also do have to do your worksheets. I know school is also an oppressive institution, but yeah. Also something that's up for debate among my contributors, by the way. So yeah, those are some bits and pieces. But again, it's all trial and error. As Billers and Bernadine Dorn say in the book, like we're just trying, failing, trying again, failing better all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and that's why I think that you can't write a how-to book, because it's like if we had those answers, like we wouldn't be living in this carceral system anymore.
Exactly.
So I think it's important to highlight that and to fail better, even when it has to do with simple things like breakfast.
Yeah.
Maya, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us. Kim, thank you so much. Thanks y'all so much for taking the time to sit down with us. Again, the book is called We Grow the World Together, Parenting Toward Abolition, co-edited by Maya Schenwar and Kim Wilson. You can get it anywhere except for Amazon. I just like putting that out there. Yeah, thanks again for taking the time.